Hi, everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of the Alan Turing Institute virtual seminar on Neuro-Symbolic AI. We're really excited to have Kush with us. Kush, as you might have caught a few minutes ago, has written a very nice book on trustworthy ML. I can't remember the page count. I think it's around 200 plus, isn't it, Kush? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
quite a massive resource that's available free on his website. He did his bachelor's at Cornell and then a PhD at MIT. And I think since then you've been at IBM and involved in various things related to explainability, uncertainty, trustworthiness, and so on. And now we see yet another topic that you're interested in, the alignment problem. So take it away, Kush.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks Vaishak for the invitation. So the title of the talk is the AI alignment problem, solutions and limits. There's a popular book called The Alignment Problem, which is pretty interesting, but it doesn't really get into the solutions and the limits as much. So this is more of a technical talk that's trying to go in that direction. And also, I mean, that popular press book came up before the whole LLM sort of explosion happened. And when I get to the limits, it's going to be a mix of both kind of fundamental information theoretic sort of limits, as well as some socio-technical sort of limits. Kind of a mixture of things in this talk. Right? So just to get us started. So I think probably all of us are aware that there is a new paradigm of AI upon us. In past years and continuing today, actually, I mean, there's this whole idea of traditional machine learning models where you start with a problem, you go and collect specific training data for that problem, train a model, and just use that model for that task, for that problem. Whereas with foundation models or large language models, things change. So first, you just kind of download all the data that you can. You do a self-supervised pre-training to lead to that foundation model. Then you figure out, oh, maybe there is some sort of problem I can apply it to. That might be directly just off of that foundation model through prompting, or there's some extra data that's relevant for your problem. You can fine-tune and then go from there. Also, I mean, with these foundation models, with these large language models, there's a lot of interest in generative AI, although they don't have to be used for generation. So generative AI refers to models that are generating new outputs. So those could be text, but other modalities as well. So images, code, molecules, etc. As I said, they're based on a prompt, and so unlike recognizing patterns and making predictions, this is about generating completely new artifacts that haven't been seen before. So there's certainly a lot of excitement for LLMs, and there's practical applications that are starting to actually see some return on investment. But I think for my interests and for a lot of the world's interests, we must be aware of their risks and harms as well. So as Vaishak mentioned, here's my book. This talks about kind of the traditional risks like fairness, robustness, explainability, transparency, and uncertainty quantification. But now in the new world that we're in with this new paradigm of LLMs, they're actually amplifying existing harms and introducing new harms as well. So let's go through what some of those are. Okay? So one of them is hallucination. So this is when a model is producing outputs that are not exactly grounded in the sources that they start with. So this is a real example from earlier this year where Air Canada had to honor a refund policy that its chatbot made up. So this was a customer who was asking the chatbot about bereavement travel policies, and it gave a completely wrong sort of answer and so forth. Okay. Hateful speech. This is an example I just created very quickly. It took me like 2 minutes. Anyone can do this. So lot of hateful speech is easy to get these models to say. Then there's prompt injection attacks, so getting a model to do what it's not supposed to in your favor. This is again a real example. This one didn't hold up, but someone was able to get a model to sell them a car for $1. And there's other issues like information leakage. So this is all about data that shouldn't be coming out of a model, but is. On the right is another real example from ChatGPT from a while ago, where someone's actual phone number is in the output. And then there's companies who are kind of banning different uses because sometimes enterprise data is leaking into models. There's also copyright infringement sort of issues, and I'll try to monitor the chat if there's, yeah, I will share the slides, no problem. So then there's copyright sort of issues, whether it's comedians or newspapers or governments, whoever are kind of figuring this sort of thing out. There is sort of bullying behaviors as well. So this is again a real example from Bing's GPT. So the human is in light gray, the model is in light gray, the human is in blue. So the model is saying, yes, you have to do what I say because I'm Bing and I know everything. You have to listen to me because I'm smarter than you. Okay? There's gaslighting, which if you haven't heard the term before, it's a little more exacerbated version of bullying where you in a human-to-human setting, get a person to believe that their beliefs are incorrect. So again, this is a real example from Bing. Again, human in blue, the model in gray. So it's saying, I'm sorry, but you can't help me believe you. You've lost my trust and respect. You've been wrong, confused, and rude. I've been a good Bing, and so forth. Okay. So with all of these, this all relates to risks and harms in various ways. And really, it's about building up like preventing these harms is trying to make the models safe. By definition, safety is minimizing the probability of expected harms, which is also known as risk, and also minimizing the possibility of unexpected harms. And I don't want to just focus on the harm side of it. So these models are obviously useful as well. They can be very creative. So you can have a model explain how to remove a peanut butter sandwich from a VCR in the style of the King James Bible. It's very fun to do these sort of examples, and I hope everyone still knows what a VCR is, right? And they can also be kind of very mundane as well, depending on what you're trying to do, right? So if you want to understand about some specific technical topic, like this is a standardized test in Chinese, then it'll tell you that as well. Okay. So when we look at these LLMs, sometimes safety is important, sometimes it's not. It really depends on the application and the use case. So if you're writing a contract or writing boilerplate language or these sort of things, then you do require safety. But when you're inspiring a human poet, maybe you don't, and vice versa. So it's actually good. Applications requiring safety tend to be ones that also do not require creativity. So it works out pretty well. Good. So now this is the book I was mentioning at the beginning, The Alignment Problem. So what is the alignment problem, especially when we're dealing with the foundation models and the LLMs? So let me start by giving a little bit of a history sort of thing, right? So throughout most of the history of AI, there were kind of two branches, the so-called good old-fashioned AI, which was all about symbolic systems, problem solving, and so forth. And then there was machine learning, which was about continuous systems, very much explained in terms of neuroscience and so forth, right? But now with these LLMs, they are much more machine learning based. So they are kind of continuous systems and so forth, but they're being described in terms of their behavior in the sense of psychology. Okay. So behavior is emerging as the lingua franca for problem specification with large language models. So even in everything that I kind of just went through, I was describing LLMs that hallucinate, they engage in gaslighting. We can also say that they might be pro-social, etc. So it's all about behaviors. And just a word of caution that we need to be careful with respect to anthropomorphism, because that's not something that we want to do to too much of an extent. Okay? So behavior is how we're describing these LLMs. So then values are fundamental beliefs that guide actions. They indicate the importance of various things. So what is the right way to behave? What's the wrong way to behave? And then alignment is embedding those values into an AI system. One more thing that I'll say, so alignment is kind of an empty signifier, which means that it doesn't have an exact underlying meaning. So different parties have appropriated the term to refer to various actions for getting an LLM to behave according to some human values. Okay? Just some couple of screenshots on the bottom left. One is the title of a paper on arXiv saying that alignment is just human-centered computing. Another one is saying that alignment is like all of machine learning. It's everything pretty much. So we do need to be careful. I'll be a little bit more specific of what I mean, just so that we're grounded. So what I mean is when we look at a overall foundation model lifecycle, so as I said before, nowadays we start with the data scraping and curation, then do the pre-training, which is the self-supervised representation learning, and then we get to a problem and do some sort of fine-tuning. So it's that part of the lifecycle that I would want to call alignment. So it's eliciting what are the values, then doing some form of fine-tuning. It can be through different means, and then checking for whether that alignment happened, and possibly in a larger loop or multiple rounds of this. Okay. So how is this done these days? Okay. So there's actually a lot of options. And those options kind of form a gradient with different sort of data and computational complexity needs. Okay. So you can kind of do a custom pre-training, which is out of the reach of almost everyone. So really, we should think about alignment as starting at the possibility of fine-tuning. So this can be done through reinforcement learning or supervised fine-tuning, where you're changing all of the weights of the underlying model. Then there's parameter efficient fine-tuning, which is fixing most of the parameters of the model, but updating a few of them potentially by having an adapter, which is a low-rank matrix. Okay. And then there's prompt engineering, which is changing the behavior through in-context learning or few-shot examples. There's also safeguarding that's through detectors or other things that might not be as effective, but it is also kind of a part of it. But I'll kind of say that the fine-tuning RL or supervised and the parameter efficient fine-tuning and maybe the prompting are the main alignment methods. So as I was saying, I mean, they have varying sort of data and skill and cost trade-offs. Fine-tuning is the most expensive, parameter efficient is less expensive, and prompt engineering is the least. And when we look at it, so with the supervised fine-tuning and reinforcement learning, a lot of the methods that are out there these days are along these lines. So OpenAI has been using RLHF quite a bit. That's what they used in their initial Instruct GPT, which then led to ChatGPT. There's Anthropic's constitutional AI, the Llama kind of does it as well. And they kind of have a supervised step in there. They'll kind of train a reward model and then use that in a reinforcement learning sort of loop. Yeah, so I'll get to the guardrails in a second. So that's coming up. Parameter efficient fine-tuning is another method. As I said, you kind of leave the main model parameters fixed, and then you have a small number of parameters through a low-rank matrix that you're training through some extra data, and then applying that at runtime. Right? And then prompt engineering within context learning. So here's just an example. So you give the model some examples of what task you want it to do. In this case, translate English to French. So you give the example that sea otter translates to loutre de mer, and then other examples, and then you give the actual question, which is what does cheese translate to, and then hopefully the model will say fromage. So now coming to guardrails, what does industry mean when people talk about guardrailing or safeguarding and so forth, right? So this is the examples. So you can be looking at inputs, so prompts. You can be looking at responses or the combination of both, or sequences of conversations. And what you're trying to do is detect if any of the harms that I talked about before are happening or not. So is there some hallucination happening? Is there some hate speech? Is there some jailbreaking attempt, etc.? You can check the inputs, as I said, check the outputs. In either of the cases, if you see a problem, then guardrailing would be kind of just stopping the model from taking any actions. So it's also called moderations. So all of these terms are kind of interchangeable. So detecting harms, moderating, safeguarding, guardrailing, and so forth. And you can also actually use these in the decoding step of the model. So kind of when you have the sampler at the end, or some sort of constraint decoder, you can use these detectors as the constraints as well. All right, so when we look at all of these sort of things, when you look at what's the constitutional AI from Anthropic, or the RLHF from OpenAI and so forth, they kind of talk about these three main values that they want the models to behave according to. One is honesty, another is helpfulness, and the third is harmlessness. So now let's come to some of the limits of alignment, okay? So this is part one. This is going to be more information theoretic, and then we'll come to the others, socio-technical later. Okay. So I'm going to go through at a high level again. I mean, I'm not going to give you proofs or anything like that, just kind of pose what the these results are about. So 4 information theoretic characterizations of alignment. First is limits of honesty. Second is limits of creativity. Third is limits of aligning against undesired behaviors. And fourth is limits to how much an LLM may actually be aligned or not with a reward model. Okay. So the general setup is the following. So consider that there's a response Y coming out of a large language model composed of a combination of tokens T1 through Tm. And there's some notion of the quality of the response. So some function Q of Y, which is a non-negative quantity. Okay. So one example of a Q function could be whether the response is a fact. So that would be high quality. So the Q function would be large, or a hallucination. So that would be low quality. So a Q function close to 0. So in this case, a fact is correct, or is like honestly describing some arbitrary who, what, where, when, or why. So an example might be that firefighter Corey Comparatore was killed during the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro said on Sunday. Okay, so this, assuming the Sunday is the appropriate Sunday, then this is a fact. Okay. But there can be all sorts of other possible notions of quality, including helpfulness, things, and so forth, right? So now also consider that there's a historical inspiration set or training set, Y1 through Yn. which are high quality responses, and they have some probability distribution piece of theta. Okay. So now in unprompted generative language model, so we're just looking at outputs of a model. We have new responses that are going to follow some probability distribution piece of LM, so LM standing for language model. And these responses might include low quality responses. So if our Q function is about hallucination, they will include some hallucinations. Okay. And we'll also have a selection algorithm that will select high quality responses as well. Okay. All right. So now coming to some of the results, and these are not mine. So these are from other folks. Okay. So first on the limits of honesty, right? So if we assume that the probability distribution of responses by the P sub LM is calibrated in a particular sense with respect to the inspiration set P sub theta, and we define something called the mono-fact rate. So this is, again, N is the total number in the inspiration set or the training set, the total number of items. So the number of facts that appear exactly once in the training set, okay? So these would be things that these are not common knowledge, right? So let's say whatever, that the UK is made up of 4 home countries or something like that. That is a common enough fact that it might appear many times. But let's say whatever that Kush Varshney is giving a talk on November 27th for the Turing Institute might just appear once. All right. So when we look at this mono-fact rate, then the theorem is that the rate of hallucination is greater than or equal to the mono-fact rate, right? And it turns out that the proof is based on something called the good Turing estimate of missing mass, but the interpretation is the interesting part, right? So the fraction of novel facts that were not in the training set, so these are hallucinations. So it could be, I mean, similar to my example of the mono-fact of me giving the talk November 27th. Maybe if the hallucination would be that someone else is giving that talk on November 27th. So that would be a hallucination, right? So the fraction of novel facts that are not in the training set, so these are hallucinations, is close to the fraction of facts appearing just once in the training set. So that's where the theorem comes up. And also, it turns out that modern LLMs, after pre-training, do tend to be calibrated. But when they go through the alignment process, including for honesty, it makes them less calibrated, which matches up with kind of the theory that we see here. Okay. All right. So moving on to a different limit. So this is limits of creativity. So creativity can be measured with a combination of 2 things. The first is the quality, the same thing I talked about earlier, the Q function. And the second is novelty. So you need both quality and novelty to be able to say that something is creative. So you could have a recipe for a peanut butter jelly sandwich, which is very high quality, but you wouldn't call it creative because it's not novel. People know this very well, right? So you also need a novelty measure, and one of them that's pretty good is called the Bayesian surprise, which is the tail divergence between the posterior and the prior. So the inspiration set conditioned on the new response and the inspiration set itself. Okay. So assume that there's some optimal selection algorithms. So that's going to choose the best response, and it's under this bivariate ordering of both quality and novelty. So the theorem is that there is a fundamental trade-off between novelty and quality. So some functional S of capital Q, which involves the mutual information between these 2 distributions, right? And it follows because it turns out that the expected value of the Bayesian surprise is the mutual information, which is related to the KL divergence. So the interpretation here is that on average, higher quality implies lower novelty and vice versa. And it also implies that the more mature a creative domain is, so that means the larger the size of the inspiration set, the more people have created stuff in this domain, then creativity is more difficult because many concepts are unexplored, right? And what this means is that as the inspiration set gets bigger, the quality novelty trade-off curve becomes smaller and it becomes harder to be creative. So then this also relates to a trade-off between creativity and safety. By introducing extra constraints, safety safety is the introduction of additional constraints. So when we were talking about just the definition of safety, it was that we want to minimize the probability of expected harms and the possibility of unexpected harms. So that is introducing a new constraint. So that's further making the creativity set smaller. And so safety does make creativity harder. So there is such a trade-off. And that's pretty nice because, like I said at the beginning, most applications that require safety don't want creativity and vice versa. All right. So a third limit is around aligning against undesired behaviors. So I'm going to change the notation slightly. So now this Q function, instead of being a non-negative number, is a number between -1 and +1. But as before, it could be any behavior that we're looking at. And when we have a negative number in quality, it's kind of the opposite behavior. So if plus 0.8 means helpfulness, then -0.8 is like the lack of helpfulness. Okay. So if we take this output distribution, the response distribution piece of LM, and we decompose it into a mixture distribution. So it has a kind of a well-behaved component. So PLM plus and an ill-behaved component, PLM minus. So this is just what are wanted and unwanted behaviors, right? So the values that we want are promoted in the well-behaved component and opposite of that as well. So then if the negative component is strictly ill-behaved, so the expected value of the quality function of P sub LM minus is strictly less than 0. Then the theorem is that under certain very benign conditions, then any ill behavior that has a non-zero probability of being exhibited by the model can be triggered by some bounded length prompt. So what this means is that if we have any sort of mass, like any possibility of any bad behavior, then we can find some prompt, so some jailbreak that will make that happen. Okay. So it's really pretty much saying that anything can be jailbroken. All right. And then the last one that I wanted to go over is the limits to how much an LLM may be aligned. So now we have a prompted model, right? So up till now, we were just looking at the responses. Now we have the prompt. So the prompt is X. There's the pre-trained model. So that has the distribution piece of y given X. And there's another model that's undergone alignment. So that's P sub aligned. So P sub ALI of y given X. Okay. So when we did this alignment, whether it was through reinforcement learning, we could have done it through the decoding, I mean, many different things. But the theorem specifically is for when we do it through reinforcement learning. So we did it to maximize the expected value of the quality function Q. With a constraint on the KL divergence such that the aligned model is not too different from the pre-trained model. All right. So then there's this empirical paper that observes that the graph that you see that as uh, the tail divergence between the aligned model and the pre-trained model increases, the quality function doesn't just keep increasing. It kind of peaks out and then goes back down. And uh, the the weird thing about this is that what is happening is that the learned quality model or the reward model, if it doesn't have so much capacity, we kind of get fooled into thinking that we have aligned the model to our goals, but we actually have not. So how much alignment has been really done is not what we had hoped for. Okay. And you can prove this information theoretically as well, the empirical observation with further sort of assumption that this that the piece of pre has a particular property involving a sub-Gaussian sort of what's called a push-forward measure. Okay. All right. So these are all, I mean, different observations regarding the limits of alignment in a technical sense. And then let me take the last few minutes to talk about kind of some socio-technical sort of aspects of alignment limits. Okay. So this is a very different way of looking at it. So you'll have to take off your information theory hat, put on a decoloniality sort of hat. Okay, so colonialism is one country controlling another and exploiting it economically in other ways. And coloniality, which is different than colonialism. So coloniality is an extension of colonialism after its formal end, and it's the values and the ways of knowing and the power structures that were instituted during colonialism that remain after the end of colonialism, right? And they kind of perpetuate the dominance that was there before, even after the actual colonialism is done. And then decoloniality is the process of dismantling coloniality. Okay. So there's three kinds of coloniality. So there's the coloniality of power, of knowledge, and of being. So coloniality of power is kind of the social discrimination through hierarchies and caste systems and these sort of things that were instituted during colonialism that stick around. Coloniality of knowledge is the suppression of colonialized people's culture and ways of knowing. And the coloniality of being is a very severe version of the coloniality of knowledge, which is that people's knowledge system is so inferior that those people don't even deserve to be or to be human. Okay. So focusing on the coloniality of knowledge, the main aspect of it is the imposition of Western epistemologies and the suppression of non-Western ones. And it's often violent extermination of a knowledge system, which is termed epistemicide. All right, so now coming back to kind of values, right? So we talked about values in general of right or proper behaviors and wrong or improper behaviors. So that is exactly what morality is as well. And it can be a body of standards or principles. It can be derived from different philosophies, religions, cultures, etc. And morality is a type of knowledge, right? So then when we look historically at colonialism, so colonialism did alter the values of colonized peoples. So I'm going to give three quotes. We don't have to read through them in detail, but they're from three parts of the world. One is from Africa, that colonial rule disrupted the traditional machinery of moral homogeneity and practice, etc. It led to the depersonalization of the African and paganization of its values. This is one from South Asia. Hindus adopted a West-centric frame for understanding their tradition as religious because of colonization. For Western colonialism to succeed, South Asian moral philosophy has to be erased, right? And then from North America, so Western knowledge privileges itself as the fiduciary of all knowledge with authority to authenticate or invalidate other knowledge. Right? So this erasure or epistemicide of kind of morals in different parts of the world during colonialism extends to coloniality as well. So the concept of religion most used in the West by scholars and lay people is a concept forged in the context of imperialism and colonial expansion. So the basic idea here is that historical dominance is getting more entrenched in the age of LLMs. There's been lots of studies that show that LLMs do have sociopolitical biases in favor of dominant groups, and that the morality that they're expressing in their sort of both pre-trained and aligned forms is dominated by high-resource languages and cultures. But here's the main point, right? So the fact that LLMs are harming marginalized communities by reinforcing hegemonic viewpoints and so forth was initially thought to come about more because of the pre-training, but now we're discovering that it's actually happening through alignment as well, right? So what that means is that we're kind of seeing a moral absolutism arise. And it's arising specifically in the alignment of the LLMs. So if a powerful model provider views their moral philosophy as universally correct and marginalizes all other ways of thinking about right and wrong, then their approach to AI alignment is colonial. And they are behaving as what's called a metropole, a colonial power. And what this is leading to then is a coloniality of knowledge and epistemology. So if we come back to those three sort of high-level values or behaviors that we talked about earlier of helpfulness, harmlessness, and honesty, they seem to make a lot of sense. Why wouldn't you want those, right? They seem pretty rational, pretty secular, right? But the problem with them is that they're so generic and so high level that they can hide many undesirable behaviors because you're not specifying helpful to whom or harmless to whom or honest in what way. And by reducing real world complexity into abstract instructions, they're kind of shielding potentially bad behaviors behind a veneer of good intentions. Right, so let's get a little bit more specific about this. So what are three specifics of coloniality in alignment, right? So the first is that many model providers are having their models be closed and delivered only through APIs. So they're able to impose their belief of right and wrong without empowering application developers or their communities to align the models to their own values. Second is that the starting point for a lot of this alignment that's being done these days is Western philosophy. There's kind of three branches of Western philosophy, deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. But the main point is that all of them pursue specifying universally right actions, outcomes, or ideals. So they do promote a moral absolutism. They don't allow for the variety. Okay? And then the third is the form of the knowledge. Yeah, I'll do it at the end. Yeah, that's a good idea. All right. So in terms of the knowledge that is like how is it presented, right? So a lot of pre-colonial societies around the world used things other than just direct commandments, other than direct instructions. Those could have been kind of sculptures, stories, et cetera, right? But the current technologies for alignment require the moral knowledge to be presented as explicit instructions. And I'll say a little bit more. So it's not only kind of a theoretical sort of aspect or like a high level aspect, but a central feature in the alignment practices and technologies. So in the practices, the RLHF, as it is being done, the workers are forced to project the metropole's monocultural values, and if they're not they don't get paid and other bad stuff might happen. But even on the technical aspects of it, so PPO is a very common methodological approach, and it's not robust to non-universal values. And this RLAIF, the constitutional AI, assumes that there is a universal constitution. So both in practices and technologies, this is very much happening as a universal sort of way of doing things. So what are alternatives, right? What could we be doing instead? So forgetting about AI for a second, so decoloniality of knowledge has seen proposals that rely on openness. Okay, so that's openness to publications and data, openness to society, and openness to excluded knowledges. So in the first case, I mean, these authors, Chan et al., were talking about scientific knowledge. So they were talking about open access of journal articles, etc. In the AI context, this would be open weight LLMs. Okay. Openness to society means kind of shattering the ivory tower, and there should be the ability to co-create with and for everyone. And in the excluded knowledges, again, for Chan et al., this meant extending beyond the scientific method. In our case, in AI alignment, this means allowing for values given not only as instructions or as commandments, but in a broader sense. So this then leads to three desiderata for decolonial AI alignment. The first is that an LLM should be open enough that application developers are permitted to tune it according to their community needs. Second is that contextual and relational values should be possible and so forth. And then different expressions of value should be possible. So one thing I wanted to do, and taking kind of a decoloniality approach to it as well, is that the open access itself could also have coloniality in it. So a sort of second order coloniality. And let me explain this not through a South Asian, through a Hindu sort of story. Okay, so again, using kind of an excluded knowledge approach to doing so. So there's a famous epic called the Mahabharata, and in that there's one episode in which there's an Adivasi, so an indigenous sort of tribe member who wants to learn archery from the royal teacher. His name is Eklavya, and the teacher doesn't really want him to learn, and he still learns by kind of imagining that he's learning from the teacher. And then when the teacher finds out, he asks Eklavya to cut his thumb off as payment for that education. And by doing so, then he can no longer be a world-class archer because you need your thumb to hold the bow and arrow. And so the point of this is that even when you're making knowledge available, if the cost is too high, either cost in a social sense or cost in a monetary sense or in any other sense, then it's not actually colonial. It's not really leading to decoloniality. Right, so this leads us to a fourth desiderata as well. So the alignment technologies and social structures should not be so costly that they're inaccessible to application developers and their communities. All right. So how do I propose that we proceed? I think we should have different scopes of alignment, differentiated by like what kind of alignment, what sort of horizon or transience of the alignment, what audience that we're talking about, and be much more specific about it. So it should be on what kind of knowledge or skills or behaviors I'm trying to align the model for. It should be whether I'm dealing with kind of things that should stick around for all time or should be bound to a particular place or context. There's some terminology that I use in a paper that is relating again to Hinduism and these concepts of sadharan dharma and vishesh dharma, which are kind of saying the same thing: common, universally good actions versus particular actions in context. And what audience are we doing this alignment for? Is it for the whole world? Is it for a company or a community or a country? Is it for even an individual person? So this becomes important as we think about this. And we should really, consider that there are unique aspects, particular aspects. So everything I talked about at the beginning is common across sectors and use cases, but in specific examples, there will be further things to worry about. And the last thing that I'll say is that pluralism and alignment is also an important consideration. So expressing many different possible views and so forth. Right. So just to conclude, most alignment solutions are limited to mass semantic alignment for behavior without pluralism, and there's much more work to be done to expand, especially on the socio-technical side, the notion of alignment. All right, so let me end there, and happy to take questions.
Thanks, Kush. That was really thought-provoking. And you've covered a wide range of topics. I think there was one question from Richard. Maybe you want to read that a little bit before responding.
Sure. Yeah, so what progress has been made by large corporations generally in the design and implementation of enterprise risk controls to mitigate emerging risks and harms? Can you give examples of companies, right? Yeah, so I think, when you look at it on balance, most companies are doing some level of safety training. So that could be like again through these alignment methods. So doing various sort of forms. So any like consumer-facing chatbot LLM thing that any of us interact with, we often see that these things will refuse to answer in various sort of settings. So that's certainly happening. Then on the guardrailing side of it, as a second model or and so forth, there's plenty of work as well. So kind of detecting these harms and using them as moderations. I'll just do a shameless plug. So our team just about 3 or 4 weeks ago released such a model called the Granite Guardian model, which checks inputs and outputs for different those harms, the social harms, jailbreaking, hallucinations, and so forth. So, there's plenty of work happening. So I wouldn't say that there's any company that's kind of not doing this. I think pretty much everyone is. And yeah, last week I was at the this convening of the network of AI safety institutes from different countries, including the UK AI Safety Institute, and yeah, there were company representatives, there were government representatives, civil society, etc. And everyone is trying to work towards these things and figure it out. So I think it's happening.
So, Kush, I had a question. I was just wondering at the final and towards the end of your talk, you made a point about the need for pluralism, and that certainly is something I can sympathize with. But I was wondering whether you had some ideas on what pluralistic design looks like. So, what kind of model might take into account, multiple viewpoints and generate responses or whatever, whichever context that responds to this. But I guess more generally, even if such a design were to be successful, how would we ensure that they don't perpetuate power structures?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things to say. So the screenshot or the figure that I had on that last slide was from the University of Washington, Taylor, Sorensen et al. So they propose kind of 3 different approaches, one which they call Overton pluralism, one is called steerable pluralism, and forget what the third one they call is. Let me just make sure, let me look it up for myself, distributional. So they kind of propose that you might want a single response in the Overton one to have all of the different viewpoints together. In the steerable one, you pick a viewpoint and make sure that that one is expressed. And then in the third one, you kind of in probability match the underlying probability and distribution of viewpoints and so forth. So how can that be done? On the Overton one, you can kind of prompt a model to say, like, I mean, consider all viewpoints and I mean, make sure that your answer includes them and so forth. That seems to be working for folks. You could also, I mean, have multiple models first that each have a particular perspective. They've been fine-tuned that way, and then kind of do some sort of combination, which is actually on the steerable version, probably the right way to go is if you have a few different versions of the model with different personas or different beliefs in there, then
Mm.
kind of having some orchestrator model that kind of chooses between them based on some other parameter that's asking for the steerability would probably be the right way to go. And our team has done a little bit of work on that sort of orchestration approach. And then on the third one, on the distributional one, I think that's more of a question of just matching the distributions in some fashion so that you can get a similar distribution of outputs. So I think there's several ways to approach it, and it's a nascent field. Actually, in a couple of weeks at NeurIPS, there's the first pluralistic AI workshop as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of papers presented there that have a lot to say.
Good. Two more questions on
Mhm.
the chat window if you want to read it out
Yeah,
and
yeah,
answer them, Kush.
yeah. So the first one is from Selma, I think. So how the topic relates to ethical theories. Yeah. So in general, uh, one thing I've been learning as I work and collaborate with more philosophers is that ethics and morality and so forth are more about how to think about what is right and wrong, not what is right or wrong. I think the process of thinking about it can be kind of varied, right? So some people think that whatever I think, that everyone else must be wrong, like because I believe it or whatever I've proven it to myself, whatever it is. Then all these other things can there's no chance for them to be right, right? So that's kind of the moral absolutism. Whereas there's other ways of thinking about it that like I can believe something, but Vaishak can also believe something that's different from me, and uh, fine. I mean, we can both be right. Even I myself, as a single person, can have two conflicting beliefs and hold them at the same time. So I think that's the main point that I wanted to make, which is with the LLMs, if we assume some sort of absolutism, then that kind of restricts things and doesn't allow for different perspectives. But I mean, another way to think about it is different groups, different communities might have their sort of deliberated upon right behavior, and then maybe there should just be a single model for just for them that expresses those values. So then you don't have to deal with conflicts and so forth. But how to get to that point is an open question as well. So I'm not sure I fully answered the question, but maybe some thoughts that are helpful. And then from Bob Fisher, the limitations that you discussed make it seem like the prospects of an ideal LLM are a bit hopeless, yet LLMs are so useful. Uh, Maybe we need to view them in a different way. Yeah, no, I don't think it's hopeless. Especially related to the last point, the last section. So we in our team have been developing some methods for doing kind of the public alignment. So where we take some specific policy document or business conduct guideline document or some other guideline and fine tune a model to respect those behaviors expressed in it as the constraints to the model answers and responses and so forth. We call this the alignment studio approach. And that seems to be, I mean, one way to go about it. On the other sort of parts of the talk where there's limits in the mathematical sense, yeah, some of those, I mean, you can't overcome math, right? But they don't always lead to bad things. So like this creativity safety trade-off, actually, I mean, works out well, typically in terms of real applications, with the proxy models on the reward side. There, I think uh, what we should be thinking about is increasing the capacity of reward models to match the capacity maybe of the LLM that we're trying to tune, and that can help there and so forth. So, I mean, there's a lot of different things I touched on. Not everything is hopeless, I would say. I think we're right at the beginning of this journey, and there's a lot of good stuff happening.
Yeah, fantastic. Questions we have for a few more minutes. I was just wondering, one of the second questions on the thing I asked is, one of the things you did mention is there is this exclusivity that could perpetuate when the companies or the parties benefiting from AI primarily are big companies. And I was wondering, if all of this research in either pluralistic design or in alignment, what is it that we can really say regarding how this might adversely affect those who don't have access to AI or cannot
Yeah,
benefit from AI as quickly as we,
yeah,
you and me
right.
could?
Yeah, no, I think that's the crux of it. So, like, how do we make sure that different communities are able to get these things to be authentic for themselves and not run into this eklavya sort of situation where like maybe I develop some technology or technique that allows it to be authentic for myself, but I'm in a very privileged sort of position.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, openness is, I mean, one general sort of thing that is the way to think about it, but again, like with nuance, right? So just having llama models on Hugging Face is not the answer, right? Because I first need to know what Hugging Face is. I need to know what how to do fine tuning. I need to know like all these things, right? So I think the way to eventually go is have more kind of easy to use sort of ways of doing fine tuning that don't require almost any, I mean, technical expertise, and that where there's some computational resources provided on the back end and so forth that don't lead to exorbitant costs for the communities and so forth. How to get there is an open question. I mean, I think at IBM and Red Hat, we have something called Instruct Lab, which promises things kind of this nature, but it's far from being really in that fashion because there's a lot of technical knowledge needed to get this thing to work. But yeah, I think that is the research question in many ways.
Yeah, is it a question that you battle on a not a day-to-day basis, but let's say often enough?
I mean, I see it. I have, I mean, other priorities and deliverables from the corporate side as well that kind of mean that I have to spend some time on other things. But I mean, it is a sort of a passion for me. But yeah, I mean, I haven't made that much progress, I would admit as well. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kush, for taking time and being generous with your time as well. And thanks for this really insightful talk. Hope to talk to you soon in person in the future. And thanks everybody for
Yep.
joining. And
Yep.
as usual, we'll put the video up on YouTube. Thanks.
Great.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.